Hey, my name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. And today I want to talk about an article that was recently published in Vanity Fair about an author named Cormac McCarthy. McCarthy wrote The Road, No Country for Old Men, All the Pretty Horses, and a whole host of other novels, and I will be so completely upfront with you, I haven't read any of them. What I did read was this Vanity Fair article, and man, this fucking Vanity Fair article, man, it is so bad. I had to sit and take it in chunks because it was making me so actively angry that I could feel my desire to skim kicking in, and I really wanted to do better by Augusta Britt than that. So let me read you the introduction so that the joke I made in my description will make sense. I'm about to tell you the craziest love story in literary history. And before you ransack the canon for a glamorous rebuttal, I must warn you, its preeminence is conclusive. Dante and Beatrice, Scott and Zelda, Vera and Vladimir, all famous cases of literary love and inspiration, sure, but these romances lack the 47-year novelistic drama of the craziest story. They lack the stolen gun, the border crossings, the violation of federal law. They lack the forged birth certificate and clandestine love letters, but above all, they lack the leading lady. The secret muse. Here I am. It's me. Hi, I'm ransacking the canon for a glorious rebuttal. At tea time, everybody agrees. I'm ransacking the canon for a glorious rebuttal. I don't, in fact, find its preeminence conclusive. I find this article to be weird and cloying, and like a thesaurus and ChatGPT got together to talk about how awesome it is to be a sex criminal, as long as you write books that people like about it. And again, I haven't read Cormac McCarthy's books. I have somehow even less interest in them than I already did, but even this article that is written from approximately 4 feet up Cormac's asshole is willing to admit that the novelist has caught criticism for not including many women in his books. Here's what Vincenzo Barney, the Cormac fanboy who wrote this Vanity Fair piece, said about that. I don't pretend to understand women, McCarthy told Oprah Winfrey in 2007, commenting on the lack of them in his novels, despite the fact that he was married 3 times, and for decades readers took him at his word. Upon McCarthy's death, however, the mystery of his personal life has drawn close enough for us to unravel assumptions into their opposites. Cormac McCarthy did not shirk womankind in his novels. On the contrary, it turns out that many of his famous leading men were inspired by a single woman, a single secret muse revealed here for the first time, a 5'4" badass Finnish-American cowgirl named Augusta Britt. A cowgirl whose reality, McCarthy confessed in his early love letters to her, he had trouble coming to grips with. The early love letters were when she was 16, by the way. Augusta is the focus of this Vanity Fair piece, at least in theory. She is repeatedly and explicitly framed as Cormac McCarthy's muse. And yeah, I guess that's the word you could use that is the absolute most generous to Cormac McCarthy to describe Augusta Britt and who she was to him. As defined by a quick Google search for what people use muse for when they use it to describe a person and not an action, it's a person or personified force who is the source of inspiration for a creative artist. But there are many words that could and should be used to describe Augusta Britt, and survivor or victim really do not feel like they should be excluded from that list. I'm going to toss a content warning in right now in case anybody clicked on this but aren't already familiar with what this Cormac McCarthy article is about from internet osmosis this past week or so since it went up. Just be aware, please, that this is a video discussing an article that is extremely fawning over a gross old man. An author who took Augusta Britt out of the country and who had sex with her when she was only 17 and he was 43. And also that there will be discussions of child abuse that was perpetrated outside of her relationship with Cormac as well, though I'm not being super explicit with it. Like always, this video will stay up, even if somehow there is some huge development in this story, as with my Liam Payne video, though I doubt it because Cormac McCarthy is already dead. So if you don't feel like this is a comfortable topic for you right now, please hold off. Come back later. It'll still be here when you are ready. This story and everything about it is complicated, like a lot of the topics that I cover here on my channel are. Augusta Britt pretty clearly does not see herself as a victim, or at least not as a victim of grooming from Cormac McCarthy. Britt is pretty clear what she's upset with McCarthy for, and it is not so much about the grooming, and it is much more about the parts where he ransacked her own, much more interesting life for parts to use in his books. Augusta calls him a groomer at multiple points in the article, but it's always as a joke, and it's genuinely hard to take any of the half-hearted concern the article tries to thread in for the underpinning dynamics of this relationship when he quite literally began his article by referring to this as a love story. The Cormac McCarthy article is not a love story at all, though, unless it's a story of how much the author loves Cormac McCarthy, of how exciting and special it feels to have discovered his hero's secret muse and now get to write about her the same way. But he's not really writing about her, not as much more than a muse, a thing, and one that belonged to his hero. And for as much as I could give a little bit of empathy to the fact that there's no way to tell this story without at least somewhat centering Augusta Britt around Cormac McCarthy, the level of cloying fanboy shit that this author threads into this article is genuinely hard to stomach. This is a grown woman, a woman who is still alive, unlike Cormac McCarthy, a dead pedophile, but as if it wasn't enough for her life to be used piecemeal in these McCarthy books without her permission. Her life, even now that McCarthy is gone and will not divide up her traits and experiences among the men he decides to write about in his next novel, gets described by the author of this article as McCarthyian. It kind of feels offensive to me. I know I just did a video about how I'm not into separatism and I'm not typically down with that, but I do feel very confident when I'm saying, wow, I wish this article had been written by a woman. Particularly, I wish that it had been written by Augusta herself, but at least by a co-author who didn't fight for enough time with both hands on the keyboard when he had one shoved down his pants and needed such frequent breaks to stroke off his copy of Blood Meridian or whatever. So before I spend too much more time ripping into the quality of the writing, which, believe you me, we will, I want to give you the broad strokes here, and to do that, I actually want to jump between this Vanity Fair piece and to The Guardian, where Lucy McKnight wrote a version of the story that doesn't spend nearly so much time exalting McCormac and cuts to the heart of it instead. The author, Cormac McCarthy, who died last year, aged 89, began a relationship with a 16-year-old when he was 42, and the woman became his secret muse, Vanity Fair has reported. Augusta Britt, now 64, told Vanity Fair that she was in and out of foster care when she first saw McCarthy at a motel pool in Tucson, Arizona that she would frequently visit. And I'm cutting from the full quote from the Vanity Fair article here. I met Cormac in 1976 when I was 16, Britt, now 64, tells me. He was 42. I was in and out of foster care at the time, and I used to go to the pool at this motel off the freeway in the south side of Tucson called the Desert Inn. It was near an area of town called the Miracle Mile. It wasn't very safe in the foster homes. They weren't allowed to have locks on bedrooms or bathroom doors, so the men would just follow me into all the rooms. But at the Desert Inn, I could use the showers by the pool to shower. Hey, use the shower to shower. That's a great line. Put that in the profile, she laughs. One day, I was at the motel pool and I saw Cormac, and I thought he looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. So I went back to the home I was staying in and realized that the man at the swimming pool was the man in the author photo on the back of the book I was reading, The Orchard Keeper. It was this beat-up old paperback. I think I paid a nickel for it in a bin outside a bookstore. So the next day, I brought it to the motel, and he was still there. I was wearing jeans and a work shirt, and I had a holster with a Colt revolver in it, which I had taken to wearing. I had stolen it from the man who ran the foster home I was in. And Cormac looked at me and he said, "Little lady, are you gonna shoot me?" And I said no. Her voice sparkles in remembered laughter. I was wondering if he would sign my book. He was so shocked. He said he was surprised that anyone had read that book, let alone a 16-year-old girl, but he said he would be delighted to sign it. Then he asked me why I carried a gun. So she told him. So, yeah, Augusta was a victim of abuse both in her home and in the foster homes that she was put in as a result of her violent, abusive, and alcoholic father. And she doesn't go into specifics about much of the trauma in her backstory before this point. It is unpacked a little bit in the article from Vanity Fair before they jump to the pool, where they continue. Every time she was hit, whether by her father or a foster parent, she would disappear inside herself. It could take weeks, months to reemerge. It got to the point where if it happened again, she didn't know if she'd ever come out, and she could no longer live like that. "So I've decided I'm not going to be hit anymore," she told McCarthy at that hotel pool. Here she pauses, and you must imagine the sweetest voice you've ever heard, a sweetness that isn't afraid to pull triggers first and ask questions later. "I'm just going to shoot anyone who tries." "Well," McCarthy said, "that would explain the gun." And that was so Cormac, Britt laughs. And I thought, thank God, this man gets it. And I'm made very sad by "this man gets it." "This man gets it" does still seem to be pretty in line with how Augusta felt about Cormac for much of her life. They maintained a relationship long after their romantic relationship ended, but this encounter by the pool, where this grown man met a child who was being abused and was carrying a gun, was, to him, the beginning of a romantic relationship. And unfortunately, we're going to get further into that, but I do want to jump back to the Guardian article here for the description of the crimes that happened, because I appreciate that they laid it out as plainly as they did. Britt said the pair began a relationship in 1997 after a beating led to her being admitted to hospital. McCarthy asked her to leave her home and come to Mexico with him. She accepted, and they traveled along the path of Blood Meridian, the novel McCarthy was researching at the time, published in 1985, which follows a fictional teenager from Tennessee who runs away from home and travels across the U.S.-Mexico border. Britt told Vanity Fair that state police and the FBI were after them at one point. McCarthy feared being found guilty of statutory rape or in breach of the Mann Act, which criminalizes trafficking, although Vanity Fair did not find any evidence of a police or federal investigation. Britt said the pair had sex for the first time when McCarthy was 43 and she was 17. That's illegal. The Vanity Fair editor's note saying that they didn't find any evidence of investigation also mentioned that crimes certainly seem to have been committed by taking her across state and country lines the way that he did. The author of this piece also interviewed other people who knew Cormac and about his relationship with Augusta and who found this all corroborated, so I feel willing to take it at its word, sure. This man met a vulnerable teenage girl and then trafficked her across state lines and began having sex with her at some point during that trafficking. And then, later, after she had left him, he worked her into his literary universe over and over again. The Vanity Fair article, in fact, is absolutely delighted with making as many comparisons to McCarthy's work as he can, which, to be fair, for the sake of a reader like me who's never actually read one of these books, it did help. It proved the point of just how much of a pattern this was, Cormac's fictionalization of Augusta, but it also just makes the article so hard to slog through at certain points because it's like, yes, I get it, he made her into men in his books. Can I hear more about this cool woman, please? So it's there, it's explained in the article. I thought it was pretty egregious. It's at least 10 of his books, and you can check the Vanity Fair article linked in the description below for those examples. They'll probably be more worthwhile from someone who's read those books than it is from me just reading names out loud that don't mean anything to me. And listen, like I said about this being complicated, I don't mean to trounce over Augusta's autonomy here and present her as so much more of a victim than she sees herself as, but she certainly is. And my overwhelming feeling is that if somebody has experienced something like this and they don't see themselves as a victim, that's okay, but that it's pretty patently irresponsible to tell that story for somebody and market it as a love story. Like, The Guardian's reporting by weeding out Vanity Fair's flowery masturbatory prose does better on this measure by a mile, because here's the closest the Vanity Fair article's author really comes to condemning all of this. He was 43. She was 17. The image is startling, possibly illegal. At the very least, it raises questions about inappropriate power dynamics and the specter of premeditated grooming, but not to Britt, who had suffered unspeakable violence at the hands of many men in her young life. Then or now. I can't imagine, after the childhood I had, making love for the first time with anyone but a man, anyone but Cormac. It all felt right. It felt good, she tells me. I loved him. He was my safety. I really feel that if I had not met him, I would have died young. What I had trouble with came later, when he started writing about me. Augusta is within her rights to feel however she does about her relationship with McCarthy. She is the one who lived it, who experienced it, and it's clear she does still feel a lot of gratitude for the fact that he helped her to leave an abusive home situation. But I do think, and I want to say, that a more truly well-intentioned man in his 40s who actually just wanted to help a teenage abuse victim without ulterior motives would have done that without sleeping with her. He would have done that without sending her erotic letters before he slept with her. And I have nuance and grace for Augusta here. I have so much empathy for her. especially when she describes to an author who really doesn't take any pains to point to this as what it is, that she was in fact uncomfortable about the sexual letters that she was receiving from Cormac before their relationship took that route. Her opinion on them eventually changed, but the changing of that opinion is just presented and then accepted uncritically. It's not presented as if this is a grown man who knew that a vulnerable child liked his books and turned to them as escapism, and then repeatedly sexually harassed her until she normalized the concept of him being attracted to her, which is what it sounds like to me. Here, I'll read. "So, about those letters," she says, running her hand along her necklace. "I haven't read them in decades. They're really hard for me. I have such a block about them. They did make me feel uncomfortable at the time because they were so different from how he talked on the phone or in person. After living with those creepy men in foster homes, it was such a relief to be with Cormac. I felt safe and secure because he didn't want anything. He was genuinely interested in me. But then he'd send these letters, and it would be very confusing. We can expect a writer to be different on person than on the page, but Cormac was very different on the page to Augusta. He was clearly in love, clearly gone on the subject of her from the start. He ends each letter with an I love you or something synonymous. He ends the ones after their romance cooled the same way. But what we appear to have with lines about pressing my face between your thighs is a writer with his nose pressed into the pure perfume between the open thighs of a book." No, yeah, rather than mentioning that perhaps writing these letters wore her down and normalized it, and that Cormac McCarthy shouldn't have written them, and that it was inappropriate, the writer of this article goes for the pure perfume between the thighs of an open book. And it's somehow not even the purplest prose in this piece. I think maybe the part where he refers to clouds as Iliads is up there for that. Not a well-written article. The grooming thing is mentioned again a bit later, though. When I ask Britt how she feels about the parental age gap between them, if the relationship felt in any way like grooming, she acknowledges the age difference will probably come as a shock to many readers, but she never felt that there was anything inappropriate about their relationship. In fact, part of her 47-year reluctance to tell her story is a fear that her relationship with McCarthy, the most important in her life, will be misunderstood by the wider public. "One thing I'm scared about is that he's not around to defend himself. He saved my life." By the time they ran away, by the time they consummated, all traces of Britt's discomfiture with the letters were gone. It was the later years, seeing herself in the Border trilogy, seeing her depression in The Passenger, that made her half wish she'd cut herself off from him. But neither of them could. It's one of a few times where the article wants to pretend that it is critical of McCarthy, but I can really only tell that it wants to be critical of McCarthy because when he explains that he initially met Augusta through a comment that she left on an earlier article he wrote about Cormac, he says that what his hero liked in the first place about his first article about him was that it was critical of him, that was part of why Augusta reached out. And if that's what sold Augusta on this author in the first place, an article that felt at all like it was hard on Cormac, it's not what she ended up getting once she had given so much of her time and attention to this author, which is a shame. What ended up being published is yet another piece of work where Augusta Britt is somehow worth less than the sum of the parts that Cormac McCarthy has already rated from her. And again, while I see this as a relationship of grooming, whether or not that's how Augusta sees it, but as she tells it, her real hurt seems to lie in, the impact that his writing had on her, and also in the lies that originally ended the relationship that he groomed her into. The article tells us that in a resentful article to her after she left him at the age of 20, Cormac wrote to her, "There was nothing wrong with our love, baby, you just threw it away." But Britt told the author of this Vanity Fair piece that the realization that Cormac had been lying about being married as well as about having a child her own age was what ended the relationship. "But the letters make me sad too," she says, between drags of the Camel-wide cigarettes we just impulsively bought. "Because I have so much regret, such wasted time when we could have been together. When we got back from Mexico in late 77, when I was 18 and we were living in El Paso, that's when I found out he was still married to Annie. And then about a year later on a trip to Las Vegas, when I found out he had a son my age, it just shattered me. What I needed then so badly was security and safety and trust. Cormac was my life, my pattern. He was on a pedestal for me, and finding out he lied about those things, they became chinks in the trust." And then when we were in Franklin, Tennessee with the Kidwells, this would have been around 79 or 80, Britt and McCarthy were much on the move in those post-Mexico years, moving to friend Bill Kidwell's house in Tennessee when they couldn't pay rent in El Paso anymore. Cormac was out pouring concrete with Kidwell and some friends and was supposed to pick me up at a certain time. And when he didn't show up, I was convinced that he was dead, and I froze. I shut down. And I realized that if something ever happened to him, I could survive physically, but I wouldn't be able to survive emotionally. I wouldn't be able to survive on my own without him, and that's not love. That's not healthy, at least. So when he won the MacArthur grant and had enough money for me to go home and see my family, I just never came back. It wasn't a choice. I always wanted to be with him, but I had to learn to live by myself before I could be with him again. So the heaps of money won by McCarthy set in motion a train of events that forever parted him romantically from Britt. McCarthy made several trips to Tucson to convince her to come back to El Paso, she says, but she couldn't bring herself to. Though they would continue to stay in close touch, to varying degrees of intimacy for the remainder of McCarthy's life, and McCarthy would later propose marriage twice, according to Britt. They never came back together in full. She did stay in his life even after leaving him, and this, on top of her own reluctance to see his grooming for what it is going to mean that a lot of people are unable to see the situation with the nuance that it deserves. A lot of people are going to be unable to take this woman at her word with the story we're being told, and also to understand the larger context behind why this man did and would have felt safe to her at the time, even if she's not willing to be the one to address that now as a 62-year-old woman. I will, though, as a 26-year-old YouTuber who's doing this on trying to be a feminist YouTuber, I'll address it. And I hope that I can do it in a way that makes it clear that I still respect her and her right to tell her own story. But I can't see this as a relationship that possibly could have been free and clear of problematic power dynamics, as a relationship that was not had because of the power, influence, and security that this man had, that this young girl comparatively very much did not. And that while his intentions might possibly have been good, which is hard for me to say because I really can't exclude the whole "and I'm also going to sleep with and write sexual letters to this child" part, but the "I want to protect this child from her family" impulse, the part that she remembers, the part that was so meaningful to her, because it impacted her in such a material way, despite the fact that just looking at the facts of this case, it is one of child sexual abuse and of trafficking by a fully grown man. Calling this a love story is irresponsible. Doing anything other than saying that while Augusta may feel differently, we should all know that a man doing this exact same thing is a freak, if he's doing it now or if he was doing it then. And we say that we do think that men who do things like this are a freak, but we culturally don't actually think that, and that's why we make excuses. We make excuses for novelists like Cormac McCarthy. We make excuses for famous men like Drake Bell, who use their influence and their position to do things like disseminate materials that are considered harmful to minors, for example. Or also Neil Gaiman. Famous men who use their influence and their position to do things like sexually harass and assault women who are their fans or who work for them. We could talk about how that is and why that happens, or we could just make excuses. Excuses like that it's a love story, or that they don't know what they're doing when they're doing it, or anything other than examining that it is again and again a pattern with wealthy men and teenage girls who imprint on their work. And I also really did marvel a bit reading this at how different some of the exact same quote pulls would feel in an article that took a more appropriate tone for this story than this flowery fanboy bullshit. Like, I am reading a story about a predator and also, less importantly, but like an all but plagiarist. And I am being told that it is about a romantic and misunderstood hero. Like this quote, for example. "He wanted to hear more about my life," which was a relief to Britt. "It was the first time someone cared what I thought, asked me my opinions about things, and to have this adult man that actually seemed interested in talking to me, it was intensely soothing. For the first time in my life, I felt just a little spark of hope, that things might be okay." I just hate that. It just makes me feel really sad. And I'm limiting the amount of things I read from this article because it is long. Just the audio version at the top of the Vanity Fair article is about like an hour and a half. But this thing is like 30,000 words long. I'm not reading the entire thing, but I will read you part of it, just to show you what I mean about how far this author bends to excuse his favorite writer's actions. But as McCarthy's interest persisted beyond stolen revolvers, whose ownerships readers will at once recognize as being transferred to Blevins from All the Pretty Horses. And how could it not? Just imagine for a moment, you're an unappreciated literary genius who has not even hit your stride before going out of print. Your novels so far have circled around dark Southern characters who do dark Southern things. You're stalled on the draft of a fourth novel called Suttree, which features an indeterminately young side character named Harrogate, not yet written as a runaway. You're sitting by a pool in a cheap motel when a beautiful 16-year-old runaway sidles up to you with a stolen gun in one hand and your debut novel in the other. She reads in her closet to stay out of Violence's earshot. To survive her lonely anguish, the wound she's been carrying since age 11, this girl has only literature to turn to. Hemingway, Faulkner, you. She flickers with comic innocence yet tragic experience beyond her years, and an atavistic insistence on survival on her own terms. She has suffered more childhood violence than you can imagine, and she holds your own prose up to you for autograph, dedication, proof of provenance. And just like that, with the impatient grandeur below accident, coincidence, you're introduced to your muse, a moral hero, a girl with a stuffed kitten named John Grady Cole. But this was 1976, the era of McCarthy's handlebar mustache, years before he would name the hero of his first commercial breakthrough after Britt's kitten, and years before he'd name the novel after the lullaby All the Pretty Little Horses she'd sing to John Grady before bed. McCarthy was then rewriting Suttree, researching Blood Meridian, and about to begin living All the Pretty Horses, a novel that follows 3 young runaways down to Mexico with a stolen Colt revolver. Having just sunk into Britt's opening pages and their hypnotic imitations of scope, he insisted on staying in touch. As I've already mentioned, Augusta also just did not like being written about, and I want to read to you some of the article here. I'm going to focus more on the line reads from things she said and parts about her, and less on the shit in this article that I've already said is annoying to me. Here's what she said about the first time he wrote about her. Then, sometime in the 80s, McCarthy sends her the manuscript for All the Pretty Horses. The first thing I see, obviously, is the title, and I thought, oh my gosh. I started reading it, and it's just so full of me, and yet it isn't me. It was so confusing. Reading about Blevins getting killed was so sad. I cried for days. And I remember thinking to myself that being such a lover of books, I was surprised that it didn't feel romantic to be written about. I felt kind of violated. All these painful experiences regurgitated and rearranged into fiction. I didn't know how to talk to Cormac about it because Cormac was the most important person in my life. I wondered, is that all I was to him? A train wreck to write about? I was trying so hard to grow up and to fix what was broken about me. I still thought I could be fixed, and this felt like the opposite of fixing me. Cormac called me and said, "What did you think about it?" And I said, well, I really liked the book. It's beautiful, but my kitten, John Grady, and everything, it feels weird. And he just laughed and said, well, baby, that's what I do. I'm a writer. I'm frankly really annoyed by that whole, I'm a writer, it's what we do, baby, pull. Like, I know a lot of famous authors throughout history who have had muses who are very identifiable in their work. I know that that's the way a lot of people kind of conceptualize characters, but also, as somebody with a cast of something like at least 15 distinct original characters, none of them were, like, based on a real person to the kind of degree Cormac seems to have just rated Augusta for character traits, other than, like, the characters who I borrowed things from myself directly to characterize in them. And it annoys the fuck out of me that he presented this to her as if it was just an inevitability of being loved by a writer, because it very much is not. I do think that she should have had some level of privacy, and I know, like, sure, by hiding away and just waiting for somebody to find her letters after he died and his estate got established or whatever for a university, we'll talk about it in a second. But, like, he just kind of, like, waited to eventually be discovered, and for her not to have any privacy over the fact that so many things in his novels were just actual traumatic events from her backstory. That is not an inevitability of being loved by a writer. You shouldn't be just, like, signing your life rights away for somebody to turn into a literary universe just by being in their life. And especially not by taking them up on your offer to get you out of your abusive home life and into another new and unstable reality where they will promise to be your only rock while also having an entire wife and a child your age who you don't even know about. And also about being written about, Augusta says, outside of her time with McCarthy, it is difficult for Britt to give her life artistic resolution. Starting with All the Pretty Horses, she would look to McCarthy for that. I always looked to Cormac's books to see how I was doing. She takes a comedic beat, which was usually dead. Her mission from the age of 11 was to be good, to survive, and yet McCarthy kept killing her. I thought he must not believe in me, she says. It's taken me decades to realize that maybe what he was doing was killing off what had happened to me, killing off the darkness. I can't imagine how complicated all of this would feel, and again, she explicitly says she thinks it's a joke when she calls him a groomer, even again at the end of the article, but this portion feels like it sums a lot of this up for me, and not in a way that absolves McCarthy of anything. I've been so afraid to tell my story, Britt tells me. It feels like I'm being disloyal to Cormac. I've always wondered, too, who would believe me. I guess I'm just more private than him, but he would always warn me that at some point his archives would open up and people would find out about me. Britt is correct. In the fall of 2025, the second half of McCarthy's archives, likely containing her letters to him, will become public at Texas State University. I know we joke around, calling Cormac a groomer. She can't help but crack a quick smile here before turning serious. But that's a defense mechanism of mine. I loved him more than anything. He kept me safe, gave me protection. He was everything to me. Everything. He was my anchor. He was my world. He was my home, even when we didn't live together anymore. Those things that happen to you, that young and that awful, you don't really heal. You just patch yourself up the best you can and move on. And Cormac gave me protection and safety when I had none. I would be dead if I didn't meet him. He was the most important person in my life, the person I love the most. He was my anchor, and now that he's gone, she pauses. I'm shiftless. Cormac McCarthy was a groomer. Whether or not Augusta Britt seriously views him that way, the things she's describing, this feeling of safety and security that she was only able to get from him, is precisely why groomers do the grooming. It's the dividends on their investment. And I do understand her hesitance to tell this story. I understand even why, if what she's afraid of is somebody saying, yeah, he's a groomer, he's an abuser, she might be okay with this weirdly romanticized version of its telling. Especially if a bunch of letters from her, either from when she was a teenager or referencing the fact that he had been with her when she was a teenager, are soon to be made public. But I don't think that this is the kind of narrative that deserves to be controlled or softened, because this is not a love story. It's not one of the craziest or greatest ones. It's a story of a man who was very, very successful at grooming a vulnerable child, who needed help and who did not need a lover. He wanted a lover, and he tried to just take her as one, despite already having a wife anyway. I don't think that whatever happened in her experience and in her emotional reality should cloud that from the outside. So this Vanity Fair piece, as written by somebody who is obviously so clouded by his open adoration of Cormac McCarthy, feels really problematic to me. I'm sorry for using the word problematic multiple times in this video, I just don't really have a better one. And I'm not saying this article shouldn't have been written, but I'm definitely saying I don't think this guy should have written it. I think this article sucked. But I would love to know what you think. Did you read this article? Have you been seeing rumblings about it online? Are you going to try to tell me that I'm not allowed to call a groomer because I haven't read The Road or whatever? I would love to hear. Let me know in the comment section down below. I also have a Patreon if you're interested in a way to help support me financially. It is a huge help. Thank you so much to my lovely Patreon supporters who are already signed up over there. You can see a couple of their names on the screen right now. I've also got a coffee if you're interested in just like a one-off tip or donation, and it's also a big help just to watch my videos all the way through to the end and to like them, subscribe to my channel, all that stuff you all are already doing. I will be back again very soon to talk about something else. I love you all very much. Bye.